She weighed more than what this town thought a woman should. She'd been abandoned in the middle of nowhere with 40 cents and a suitcase full of broken promises. And when the toughest, most closed-off rancher in all of Montana Territory walked past her, every single person in Black Creek held their breath, waiting for him to laugh like the rest of them did. He didn't laugh. He stopped. He looked at her, really looked at her, and said 4 words that would change both their lives forever. If you've ever been told you were too much or not enough, this story is for you. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The sky over Black Creek had been the color of a bruise for 3 days straight. Not the kind of bruise that fades, the deep, ugly kind that settles into bone and stays there through winter. Clouds hung so low over the Rockies that the mountain peaks had disappeared entirely, swallowed up by something mean and gray and patient. Old Harlan Briggs, who ran the feed store and had lived in this part of Montana longer than most men had teeth, looked up at that sky on the morning of November the 4th and told anyone who'd listen that the worst storm in a decade was coming. Nobody much argued with him. The town of Black Creek was the kind of settlement that existed because it had to, not because anyone had particularly wanted it there. It had sprouted up around a silver strike back in '71, grown fat and rowdy for a few years, then shrunk back down to something harder and meaner when the easy silver ran out. What remained was a main street of maybe 14 buildings, a general store, a saloon, a boarding house, a livery, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and a scattering of businesses that barely kept themselves alive through the long Montana winters. The people who stayed after the boom weren't dreamers anymore. They were survivors, and survivors in places like Black Creek had a particular cruelty to them that came from having been disappointed too many times. It was into this town, on that bruise-colored November morning, that Wade Coulter rode. He came in from the north on a big roan gelding named Trick, a horse with a bad habit of biting strangers and a good habit of not dying in hard weather. Wade rode the way a man rides when he's thinking about something other than riding. Loose in the saddle, hat pulled low, his jaw set in that particular way that the few people who knew him recognized as a man fighting a war inside his own head. Wade Coulter was 38 years old and looked 45. Not because he was ugly. He wasn't, or hadn't been once. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair gone silver at the temples, and a face that had seen enough weather to look like it was made from the same stone as the mountains behind him. He had steady gray eyes and large, scarred hands, and a mouth that, when he wasn't careful, went thin and hard in a way that made people step back without quite knowing why. He'd built his ranch, the Double C, from a single homestead claim and 15 head of cattle 12 years ago, and he'd worked it through drought and disease and brutal winters through nothing but stubbornness and an almost animal refusal to give up. He'd also buried his wife 3 years ago on a hillside above the north pasture, and he hadn't been quite right since. Not that he'd talk about that. Wade Coulter didn't talk about much of anything anymore. He tied Trick outside the general store and went in to collect the order he'd put together 2 weeks ago. Flour, salt pork, lamp oil, coffee, ammunition. Essentials. Nothing extra. He lived lean now, didn't see the point of anything that wasn't strictly necessary, which was maybe why the ranch house had started looking the way it did. Curtains his wife Margaret had hung still on the windows but gray with dust. A kitchen that smelled of coffee and not much else. A dining table he hadn't sat at properly in months because sitting at it alone made something in his chest pull tight in a way he couldn't manage. He'd had a housekeeper for a while after Margaret passed. Old Mrs. Fenwick from the edge of town, who came 3 days a week and kept things from falling apart entirely. But Mrs. Fenwick had moved to Billings in September to be near her daughter, and in the 8 weeks since, the Double C had gone from merely lonely to something approaching derelict. Last week he'd found mold on the bread he'd baked himself, which he hadn't even noticed going stale because he'd been eating maybe once a day, and couldn't taste the difference anymore. His ranch hand, a Mexican vaquero named Emilio, who'd been with him 6 years and was one of maybe 3 people Wade genuinely trusted, had looked at him over breakfast last week and said, very quietly, "Jefe, you need to find someone to help with the house. Before the storms come. Before you disappear completely." Wade had told him to mind his own business, but Emilio wasn't wrong, and Wade knew it, which was the main reason he'd ridden into Black Creek today. He needed a housekeeper. Someone who could cook and clean and keep the place from swallowing itself alive through the winter months. He wasn't asking for much. He wasn't asking for anything complicated. He paid for his supplies at the counter without much conversation. Tom Heller, who ran the general store, had learned over the years that Wade Coulter wasn't a man who needed pleasantries, and was loading the last of it into his saddlebag when he heard the laughter. It was the particular kind of laughter that stops you, not the warm kind, not even the raucous kind that spilled out of the saloon on Friday nights. This was the kind that had teeth in it, the kind that was pointed at someone specific and meant to draw blood. Wade looked up. Across the main street, outside the boarding house run by a woman named Dora Hatch, 3 men were standing in a loose half circle on the boardwalk, and they were laughing at someone sitting on the bench beside the door. He almost kept loading. He almost didn't look close enough. But something made him look, and once he looked, he couldn't quite turn away. She was sitting very straight on that bench, which was the first thing he noticed. Given what was happening around her, given the way those men were carrying on, given the sharp November wind cutting down the main street like a blade, she was sitting straight as a fence post, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance, like she'd decided the middle distance was more interesting than the people making her life miserable. Beside her sat a worn leather suitcase, the brass clasps gone green, one corner reinforced with a length of rope tied in a careful knot. She was a young woman, maybe 22 or 23, with dark hair pinned up under a blue wool hat that was a size too small and doing nothing useful against the wind. She was, as his mother would have said, a big girl, not just tall, but full-figured in a way that the thin-waisted ladies of Black Creek, who wore their corsets like armor, would have considered a catastrophe. Her coat was too light for this weather. Her boots had a crack along the left sole that he could see from across the street, and those 3 men were laughing at her like she was the funniest thing they'd seen all month. Told you nobody'd take her in. One of them, a red-headed man Wade recognized vaguely as a miner who worked a claim up valley, was slapping his knee. Dora Hatch won't even keep her another night, not after what happened. Can you blame her? The second man, heavy-set, leaned on the post. Come all the way out west and your man takes one look at you and runs? Can't say I'm surprised, looking at... She's going to freeze out here before anyone takes her, the first one said, and laughed again. The woman on the bench did not move, did not flinch. Her jaw tightened. Wade could see it, even from across the street, but she kept her eyes fixed on that middle distance, and her hands folded in her lap, and her back straight, as if the bench were a throne, and these 3 idiots were beneath her notice. Wade finished buckling his saddlebag. He walked across the street. I didn't exactly know why. He told himself many times over the past 3 years that he was done getting involved in things that weren't his business, done caring about problems that weren't his to solve. Margaret used to say he had a problem with walking past people who needed help. You can't fix the whole world, Wade. And he'd spent 3 years since her death trying to prove her right by keeping his head down and his nose out of other people's trouble. But there was something about the way that woman was sitting, the dignity of it, the absolute refusal to crumble under something that would have crumbled most people. He walked up to the boarding house, and the 3 men stepped back without him saying a word, because Wade Coulter had that effect on people when he moved with purpose. He stopped in front of the bench, and for the first time the woman looked directly at him. Her eyes were brown, dark as creek water in October, and they had that guarded look he recognized, the look of someone who'd learned that most people approaching them were not bringing good news. You looking for work? He said. Not the most elegant thing he'd ever said, but it was what came out. She stared at him. Excuse me? Work. Are you looking for it? He pulled his hat off, held it in front of him, a gesture his mother had drilled into him as a boy around women. I run a cattle ranch about 9 miles north of here. I need a housekeeper, someone who can cook, keep the house, help manage things through winter. It's not easy work and it's not elegant. You'd have your own room and 3 meals a day and pay at the end of each month. The 3 men behind him had gone quiet. The woman was watching him with an expression he couldn't read. Wary. Measuring. Like she was looking for the angle. Why are you asking me? She said. You're sitting outside with a suitcase, he said. Seems like you might need somewhere to be. There's a woman down the street who might have laundry work, she said, and there was something careful in her voice, testing something. I don't need... Laundry work won't get you through a Montana winter, he said flatly. He looked at her coat, the cracked boot sole, the hat that was doing nothing. My ranch is heated. You'd be indoors most of the time. It's honest work, and I'm not a man who makes problems for the people working for him. He paused. I'm Wade Coulter. I've got references if you need them. Behind him, he heard one of the men snort. "You can't be serious, Coulter." Wade turned around. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the man with those flat gray eyes until the man found something fascinating to look at on the opposite side of the street. Wade turned back. The woman was looking at him differently now. Still guarded, but something had shifted. She had a strong face. Not what people around here would call pretty, perhaps, because people around here had a narrow idea of what pretty meant. But there was character in it. Intelligence. Something that had been through weather and come out the other side. "I'm Clara Whitmore," she said finally. "I can cook, clean, mend, manage a household budget, and I know how to put up preserves and smoke meat for winter. I'm not afraid of hard work." A pause. "I'm also not stupid, Mr. Coulter. So if this is something other than what you're saying it is..." "It's not," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. She picked up her suitcase and stood, and she was nearly as tall as he was, which somehow surprised him, though it shouldn't have. He reached for the suitcase. She didn't let go of it immediately, held on for just a second, that reflex of someone who'd learned not to let things be taken from her, then released it. "The wagon's over here," he said. He walked her back across the main street while the town of Black Creek watched in the particular stunned silence of people who have just seen something they didn't expect and don't know what to do with yet. The ride to the Double C took the better part of 2 hours on the rough track north, and it passed mostly in silence, which suited both of them. Wade drove the wagon. Clara sat beside him with her suitcase between her feet, watching the landscape unfold around them. The rolling brown grassland going white at the edges where the first real snow had come. The dark line of pine forest along the ridgeline. The mountains going purple in the fading afternoon light. She asked no questions. He offered no information. It was the kind of silence that was cautious rather than comfortable, two strangers finding the boundaries of each other. He noticed, without staring, the small things. The way she looked at the land, not with the pinched worry of someone wondering what they'd gotten themselves into, but with something that might have been hunger. Like she'd never seen so much open space before and didn't quite know what to do with the feeling it gave her. She pressed her lips together against the wind. She had ink stains on the side of her right hand. He thought about saying something and then didn't. The Double C came into view around a bend in the track, and he watched her face when she saw it. The 2-story ranch house built from pine logs and good Montana stone, the large barn, the smaller outbuildings, the fencing disappearing into the distance around the winter pastures where the remaining cattle stood in dark clusters against the cold. In summer, it was genuinely a fine spread. In November, under a heavy sky, it had a battered, besieged quality to it, like something that had been fighting and hadn't decided yet whether it was going to win. "It's large," she said, and her voice was careful, neutral. "More than I can keep up with alone," he said. That was as close as he got to explaining anything. He showed her the house. He was aware, walking through it with her, of how it must look. The dust settled on surfaces that hadn't been touched in weeks. The cold kitchen, the dining table with a coffee ring on it that had been there so long it might as well have been carved in. The parlor where Margaret's sewing basket still sat beside the chair she used to sit in, because he hadn't moved it and couldn't quite explain why. He felt something in his chest that wasn't embarrassment exactly, but was close to it. "The kitchen is through here," he said, pushing open the door. "Pantry's stocked. I ordered enough supplies in September to get through winter. Root cellars through the back door of the kitchen. The stove..." He stopped. "It's a good stove, burns wood and coal both. I'll make sure there's always enough fuel." Clara walked into the kitchen and looked around it with a professional kind of attention that had nothing sentimental in it, opening the pantry door, checking the stove's condition, testing the pump at the sink. "It's a good kitchen," she said, which surprised him. "You think?" "The layout is practical." She turned to him. "Where would I sleep?" He showed her the small room off the kitchen. It had been the original housekeeper's room when the house was first built, back when there had been a cook and 2 other help living on the property. It was clean, at least. He'd made sure of that. Small iron bed, pine dresser, a window looking out toward the barn. She set her suitcase on the bed and looked around. "It's fine," she said. "I'll leave you to settle in," he said. "The ranch hands eat supper at 6:30. There are 3 of them, Emilio, Dusty, and a boy named Pete who just started in September. They'll eat in the kitchen. You eat wherever you like." He was turning to go when she said, "Mr. Coulter." He stopped. "Thank you," she said, and her voice had something raw at the edges of it that she was working to keep contained. For the offer of work. I appreciate it. He nodded once. 6:30, he said, and left her to it. He almost stayed in the barn past supper. He did in fact find reasons to stay out there, checking on the horses, looking over the condition of the winter tack, having a conversation with Emilio about the condition of the north fence line that he could have had in the morning. Emilio listened to all of it with his usual patience, and then, when Wade ran out of things to inspect, said, "She seems capable." "She seems capable," Wade agreed. "You hired someone." "I did." Emilio looked at him. "You going to eat supper?" Wade was about to say he'd eat later when the smell hit him. It came from the direction of the ranch house, drifting across the cold yard on the evening air. And it was the smell of bread. Real bread, yeast bread, the kind with a crust that crackled. And underneath that, something with onions, something with meat, something rich and warm that turned the cold air momentarily into something else entirely. He hadn't smelled anything like that in 3 years. He stood there in the doorway of the barn for a moment, holding very still, feeling something inside his chest, do something complicated that he didn't have good words for. Come on, Emilio said quietly, and clapped him once on the arm. The kitchen was warm, actually warm, the stove going full, and the windows fogged with steam, the kind of warm a kitchen gets when someone who knows what they're doing has been working in it for hours. Clara had her back to them when they came in, stirring something on the stove, and the table, the long plank table Wade had eaten at twice in the past month, was set, actually set. Plates, tin cups, a cloth laid down the center, a pot of beans, a basket of bread, golden crusted, still steaming. Pete, who was 17 and had a face like an eager puppy, was already sitting down and looking at the food with an expression of pure reverence. Dusty, the older of the ranch hands, had taken his hat off without being asked, which was not something Dusty generally did indoors. Clara turned around and looked at the men coming in. "Wash your hands if you haven't," she said. It wasn't a request and it wasn't sharp. It was just a statement of how things would be. Wade watched Dusty go immediately to the pump without argument, which was something. They ate. He couldn't, later, trying to describe it, even to himself, explain exactly what it was about that meal. It was simple enough food. Beef stew with root vegetables, the bread, a pot of beans with salt pork, dried apple cobbler that she'd managed from the pantry stores. Nothing that anyone would have called fancy. But it was made with attention, with the kind of care that turned flour and water and a hot oven into something that tasted like civilization. Pete ate 3 bowls of stew and looked like he might cry. Dusty said, around a mouthful of bread, "Miss Whitmore, I have eaten in 6 states and 2 territories, and this is the finest bread I have had in recent memory." "Don't talk with your mouth full," Clara said, and then, when Dusty looked startled, added, "But thank you." Wade said nothing. He sat at the end of the table where he hadn't sat in months, and he ate, and he kept his eyes mostly on his plate, and he was very aware of the candle she'd found somewhere and lit in the center of the table. Margaret used to light candles at supper. He'd forgotten about that. He'd forgotten about a lot of things. When he finished eating, he pushed back from the table and said, "Good meal, Miss Whitmore." She was already clearing plates, her back to him. "Good night, Mr. Coulter." He went upstairs. He sat on the edge of his bed in the dark for a long time, not sleeping, listening to the sounds from the kitchen below. The scrape of plates being washed, the low murmur of Clara talking to Pete about something, the clatter of pots. Small sounds. Domestic sounds. The sounds of a house that was briefly not empty. He pressed his hands flat on his knees and stared at the floor. "You're being ridiculous," he told himself. "She's your housekeeper. She cooked a meal. That's what you hired her to do." Outside the window, the first real snowflakes of the season had started to fall, small and precise and relentless, beginning their long work of burying everything. The next morning, he came down to find coffee already made, hot and strong, sitting on the back of the stove. Clara was at the table with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil, making some kind of list. She looked up when he came in, and there was a moment, brief, awkward, where neither of them said anything. "Coffee's ready," she said, and went back to her list. He poured himself a cup and stood at the window drinking it, looking out at the snow that had come in the night, 3 inches of it across the yard. The fence rails turned white, the mountains completely gone behind low clouds. "I'm making a list of what needs doing in the house before the real cold comes," she said, not looking up. Gaps in the window frames in the two upstairs rooms. The water pump in the kitchen needs a new leather washer. There's something wrong with the draw in the parlor fireplace. It'll smoke if you use it. The root cellar door seal is gone, which means you'll lose produce to freezing. She paused. I can address the window gaps and the pump seal myself. The fireplace and the root cellar you'll need to look at. He turned from the window. She was looking at him now, waiting. He hadn't had anyone look at the ranch that way in 3 years. Not as a set of problems to be solved, just as something that existed, deteriorating, waiting to be dealt with. How much of the pantry stores did you take inventory of? He asked. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite relief, but close, like she'd been waiting to see if he was going to be difficult about this. Half. I'll finish this morning. Good. He drank his coffee. Anything else? She picked up her pencil again. The curtains in the parlor need washing or replacing. The dining room... She stopped. Actually, do you want the full list or just the urgent ones? Full list, he said. She turned the paper toward him. It was meticulous, organized by category set. Kitchen, structural, heating, storage, with a rough sense of priority and in some cases, cost estimates. Tidy handwriting, the kind that came from someone who'd spent real time learning it. He looked at it for a moment. Then he said, Where did you work before? She hesitated. Various places. He didn't push. All right, he said. Start with the windows. I'll look at the root cellar today. She picked up the list and went back to work. By the end of the first week, he had to admit something to himself that he hadn't expected. Clara Whitmore was the best worker he'd ever had in his house. Not in a showy way. Not in the way that announced itself and waited for approval. She just moved through the ranch house quietly, steadily, dismantling chaos and replacing it with order. Scrubbing the grime from surfaces, patching the gaps in the window frames with a competence that suggested she'd done it before. Reorganizing the pantry into something logical, washing the curtains Margaret had hung and returning them to the windows without comment, working from before sunup until after the men had eaten supper and the kitchen was clean. She didn't ask for praise. She didn't seem to need it. She'd ask a practical question when she needed something, listen to the answer without fuss, and then go do the thing. If Wade moved something or left something in the wrong place, she'd move it back without saying anything. She had a system, and the system made sense. She also had a way with the ranch hands that Wade found himself watching. Pete, the young one, had attached himself to her within 2 days with the single-minded devotion of a stray dog that's found someone kind. She tolerated this with more patience than Wade might have managed, answering his questions, letting him carry things, occasionally finding something useful for him to do when he was underfoot. She'd figured out within a week that Dusty had a bad knee he wouldn't admit to, and had started leaving a liniment on the kitchen shelf, and not saying anything about it, and he'd been taking it without either of them acknowledging it. Emilio she treated with a kind of quiet respect that was mutual and that Wade noticed but didn't comment on. She didn't talk much at meals. Neither did anyone else, particularly, except Pete, who made up for the general quiet with a relentless stream of opinions about horses, weather, and the 3 cattle barons he'd worked for before coming to the Double C. But sometimes in the evenings, if Wade was in the parlor working over the ranch books, he'd hear her in the kitchen humming something low and tuneless while she worked, and the sound would catch at him in a way he couldn't explain. It was the sound of someone who was still there, still present, still alive inside the space they occupied. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed that. 12 days after Clara arrived at the Double C, Wade rode into Black Creek for supplies, and the town let him know exactly what it thought. It started at the general store. Tom Heller leaned on the counter while Wade put together his order and said, with the careful casualness of a man delivering a message he'd been commissioned to deliver, "Folks are talking, Wade." "Folks always are," Wade said. "I mean about the woman you've got out at your place." Wade put a sack of flour on the counter without looking up. "My housekeeper." "That's what some people are calling her." Heller paused meaningfully. Wade ignored the pause. "There's concern," Heller continued, "about your reputation, and hers being out there without—" "She has her own room and her own door that locks," Wade said. "And if anyone has a question about how I run my ranch and who I hire to help me do it, they're welcome to come say it to my face." Heller went quiet. It got worse at the saloon, where Wade went to collect a package the supply rider had left with the barkeep. A rancher named Donnelly, who ran a spread to the south, and who Wade had had a complicated and generally unpleasant relationship with for years, was at the bar with two of his hands. "Heard you took in the fat girl Hatch throughout," Donnelly said. Loud enough to carry. The conversational tone of a man who knows exactly what he's doing. Wade picked up his package. "That true?" Donnelly pressed. "Brought her all the way out to your place?" Wade Coulter, who hasn't looked at a woman since his wife died, hires the one woman in the territory nobody else wanted? He shook his head with the elaborate sadness of someone performing sympathy. "Must be desperate, is all I can say." Wade turned around. The saloon went quiet. "Donnelly," Wade said, and his voice was very even, "I'm going to give you one chance to close your mouth. I'm just saying, you're not just saying anything. You're making trouble for a woman who has done nothing to you, and you're doing it because you've got nothing better to do, and not enough sense to know it." He held Donnelly's gaze until the other man looked away. "I'm going to walk out of here now, and if I hear her name in your mouth again, we're going to have a different kind of conversation." He walked out. He stood in the cold street for a moment, hat in his hands, breathing the frozen air. The thing that bothered him, he realized, as he untied Trick from the post and pointed him north, the thing that had been sitting at the edge of his thoughts since he'd hired her, was that the town wasn't entirely wrong about one thing. Not the cruelty of it, not the ugly things being said, not any of that. But the essential observation that he hadn't looked at a woman since Margaret died. That was true. He hadn't wanted to. I wasn't sure. Riding home through the snow with the wind cutting across the open pasture and the mountains gray and close on both sides, if he was entirely sure it was still true. And that was a problem he didn't know what to do with yet. He got back to the ranch as the sun was going down behind the clouds, the sky turning from gray to dark gray to black in the way it did out here in November, quickly, like a door closing. He put Trick up and was crossing the yard toward the house when he heard the chopping. He stopped. Around the side of the house, near the woodpile, Clara was splitting wood. She'd taken off her coat, which, he thought immediately, was insane in this temperature. And she was working with his splitting maul, which weighed at least 8 pounds, and she was doing it well. Not the tentative hacking of someone who'd never split wood before, but the clean, practiced strokes of someone who'd done this before and had a good sense of angle and momentum. Each log split clean, and she kicked the pieces aside without looking down. He stood there for a moment. "What are you doing?" he said. She looked up. She had color in her face from the cold and the exertion, and her hair had come half loose from its pins. "We were low," she said. "I wanted to get ahead of it before the weather turns." "Where's Pete?" "I sent him to fix the section of fence you said was weak. He'd have been done faster if he wasn't helping me." She hefted the maul again. "I don't need anyone to split wood for me, Mr. Coulter." He should have left it there. "Put your coat on," he said instead. She blinked. "Excuse me?" "You'll get warm fast and then cold fast, and that's how people get sick in winter. Put your coat on." He walked over and picked up his coat from the pile. She'd apparently used it as an apron to collect smaller chips of wood, and held it out to her. She looked at him, looked at the coat. Something in her expression shifted through several things he couldn't follow. She took the coat and put it on. "Thank you," she said, and it had the same rawness to it as the first time she'd said it. He nodded, took the maul from her. "How many more do you need?" "Another cord would see us comfortable," she said. "Go start supper," he said. "I'll finish this." She didn't argue. She gathered the split wood into her arms and turned toward the house, and Wade lifted the maul and buried it in the next log. And for a moment they were just two people doing the work that needed doing before the storm came, the darkness settling around them and the first flakes starting to fall again. And it was almost like something normal, almost like something that made sense. He split wood for an hour after she'd gone inside, until his shoulders burned and the yard was covered in 2 inches of new snow. And when he finally came in and stood in the kitchen doorway, stomping the cold from his boots, she handed him a cup of coffee without being asked and went back to the stove. He stood in his own kitchen, in the warm, and drank his coffee, and didn't say anything, and neither did she. And that was somehow the most alive he had felt in 3 years. The snow that had started falling in small, precise flakes the night Wade split wood turned serious by the first week of December. Not the photogenic kind of serious, not the quiet, blanketing kind that made the mountains look like a painting and the children in town go wild for their sleds. This was Montana serious, which was a different thing entirely. The wind came down from the north with the kind of intent that felt personal, driving the snow horizontal across the open pasture, building drifts against the barn and the fence lines that could swallow a horse to the shoulder. The temperature dropped to 20 below and stayed there. The water in the barn trough froze overnight despite the coal stove Emilio kept running, and every morning the men started the day breaking ice before they could do anything else. Wade had seen bad winters. He'd ranched through 3 genuinely dangerous ones and come out the other side. So he had a practical, unsentimental relationship with what Montana could do. He prepared for it. He laid in fuel and feed and provisions, and he checked his structures and he made his calculations about what the cattle could survive and where. And then he worked from before dawn until after dark every day, and accepted the losses when they came, because they always came, and that was ranching. What he hadn't accounted for, in his preparations, was Clara, not in the way he would come to think about later. In the simple, practical sense, he hadn't quite anticipated what it would mean to have another person in the house when the real cold hit. The ranch house was built for Montana winters. Thick walls, good stoves, a design that kept heat from escaping through the roof. And with someone actually managing the interior heating, keeping the fires banked properly through the night, blocking the drafts in the upstairs rooms with rolled blankets wedged along the baseboards, the house was genuinely warmer than it had been in years. Warmer than it had been since Margaret. He noticed it without wanting to notice it, the way you notice a sound has stopped, by the absence of the discomfort you'd gotten used to. Clara moved through the harder weather with the same steady practicality she'd brought to everything else, adapting without complaint, solving problems as they appeared. When the cold snap hit and the kitchen pump froze solid despite the rag wrapping Wade had put around the pipe, she melted snow on the stove to cook with and went about her work without making a production of it. When the wind found a gap in the parlor wall that nobody had known about and turned the room into an icebox, she tracked the draft to its source, plugged it with a mixture of wood filler and linseed oil she'd found in the storage room, and told Wade about it at supper as a simple statement of fact. "How did you know to do that?" he asked. She looked up from her plate. "My father built houses," she said, in the tone of someone reporting useful background information and nothing more. "Before he—" She stopped, went back to eating. "I picked things up." He didn't push. There were a lot of sentences she started and didn't finish, and he'd learned over the weeks not to push at them. Not because he wasn't curious, he was, in the measured way he was curious about most things, the way a man who doesn't talk much tends to be a careful observer, but because he recognized the pattern, the careful parceling out of personal information, the instinct to give only what was strictly necessary. He did the same thing himself, and he knew what it meant. It meant someone had learned, at some point, that sharing things about yourself gave other people something to use against you. Whatever Clara had been through before she landed on that bench outside Dora Hatch's boarding house, it had taught her that lesson well. The ranch hands had settled into a comfortable arrangement with her by mid-December. Pete was essentially her shadow, which she managed with a patience Wade could only admire. Dusty had stopped leaving his boots on in the kitchen without being asked. Emilio, who Wade trusted more than anyone still living, had said only one thing to Wade about her directly. "She's the real thing, Jefe. Not performing. You understand what I mean." Wade understood. There was a certain kind of person who worked hard because they needed to be seen working hard. And then there was a kind who worked hard the way they breathed, because it was simply what you did, because stopping wasn't an option, because the work was its own justification. Clara was the second kind. The trouble with the town didn't stop because the weather got hard. If anything, it got more pointed, the way some people's cruelty does when they're cold and cooped up and looking for somewhere to put their bad temper. The first real incident happened when Clara went into Black Creek for supplies in the second week of December, taking the wagon herself because Wade was dealing with a section of fence that had come down in the wind. He told her to go, told her what was needed, and she'd gone without any indication that she thought it might be a problem. She came back 2 hours later with everything on the list and a bruise forming along her cheekbone where the cold had hit. No, not the cold. He'd seen enough to know the difference. He was in the barn when she came back, and she drove the wagon in and climbed down and began unloading with her back to him, and he watched her for a moment before he said quietly, "What happened?" "Nothing happened," she said, not turning around. "I got the supplies." "Clara." She stopped. She didn't turn around. "One of the women at the store," she said. She said something, and A pause. I said something back. It escalated. It was handled. She picked up a crate of provisions. "I'm not made of glass, Mr. Coulter. I don't need—" "I didn't say you did," he said. He waited. What did she say? She turned around then. The bruise was from where the wind had driven a piece of ice, or so she claimed. And maybe that was even true because her eyes were dry and her voice was steady, and she was not clearly a woman who cried in front of people. She told me that Wade Coulter's charity case needed to find another town to embarrass herself in, and that the whole territory was laughing at a man stupid enough to bring home a woman like me. The silence lasted a moment. And what did you say back? He asked. Something crossed her face that might, under different circumstances, have been amusement. I told her that I was earning my wage and minding my business, and that she ought to try one of those things. Despite everything, Wade felt something pull at one corner of his mouth. That'll do, he said. She threw a handful of flour at me, Clara said. That part was less dignified. Who was it? It doesn't matter. Clara, it doesn't matter, she said again, and her voice had that flat edge that meant the conversation was over. She picked up her crate and carried it toward the house, and he let her go, because he recognized that tone too, from the inside. But he rode into Black Creek the following morning, and he didn't split his time between stops the way he normally would. He went to the general store and he had a conversation with Tom Heller about who shopped there and what the terms of their continued doing so would be, and he was more direct about it than he usually liked to be. Then he went to see Donnelly, who he suspected was behind most of the organized unpleasantness. He didn't threaten Donnelly. He didn't need to. He just made clear, standing in Donnelly's cold yard with his horse at his back and 8 inches of snow on the ground, that there were ways in which this could go, and Donnelly could choose which one he preferred. He didn't tell Clara about any of it. She would have hated it, and anyway, it wasn't entirely about her. It was also about the fact that Wade was tired of people treating his ranch like a subject for discussion and his decisions like community property. December deepened and the cold deepened with it, and life on the Double C contracted inward the way it did every winter, the world shrinking down to the space between the house and the barn and the near pastures. The days took on a rhythm that was hard in the way that purposeful things are hard. And there was something about that rhythm that Wade found himself leaning into in a way he hadn't leaned into anything in a long time. He started eating every meal at the table. That sounds like a small thing, and it was, except that he hadn't been doing it. He'd been eating over the counter most mornings, and skipping the midday meal altogether, and appearing for supper more out of obligation than appetite. But Clara kept the table set, kept the food hot, and there was something about sitting down at a set table with warm food in front of you that made it harder to convince yourself that eating was optional. Nate. He sat at the end of the table, and Clara sat at the side nearest the stove, and the ranch hands filled in between them, and there was conversation, Pete mostly, with occasional commentary from Dusty, and the kind of quiet, dry observations from Emilio that could make everyone laugh if you were paying attention. Clara didn't say much, but she listened, and sometimes she'd say something short and precise that reframed whatever had just been said in a way that made everyone stop and think. She was smart, smarter than she showed, and he suspected that was deliberate, that she'd learned to hold that back too. One night, maybe 2 weeks into December, he came in late from the barn, where one of the mares had been colicky, and he'd spent 3 hours with her before she settled. Everyone was in bed. The kitchen was dark, except for the low glow of the banked stove, and on the table was a covered plate and a note that said, "Kept warm, coffee on the back burner." No signature, but it didn't need one. He stood in the kitchen at 11 o'clock at night and ate cold beef stew that was still, somehow, better than anything he made himself, and drank coffee, and looked at the 4 words on that piece of paper, and felt the complicated pull in his chest that he'd been ignoring since the first supper and was going to have to deal with eventually. He wasn't ready to deal with it. He washed his own plate, put out the stove light, and went to bed. The blizzard came on a Thursday. It announced itself the way the bad ones always did. A sudden stillness in the morning, the kind where the air feels like it's holding its breath, and then by noon the sky went the color of old pewter and the wind started, and by mid-afternoon you couldn't see the barn from the house. Wade had been watching the signs for 2 days and had done what could be done. Brought the most vulnerable cattle into the lower pasture with access to the windbreak, brought extra feed to the barn, made sure the water situation was handled, checked every structure he could check. He sent Pete to stay in the bunkhouse rather than trying to cross the yard in the dark, told Dusty and Emilio the same thing, and came back to the house just as the snow turned from falling to screaming. Clara met him at the back door. She handed him a towel for his face, which was raw from the cold, and stepped back to let him in, and didn't say anything about the snow he was tracking across her clean floor or the state of his coat, which was frozen in places. How bad? She asked. Bad, he said. Could be 2 days. She nodded. I've got enough in the pantry. The water barrel in the kitchen is full. He started stripping off his frozen outer layers, and she turned to give him privacy, going to the stove to check something. And he said to her back, You don't need to stay up. I wasn't planning to sleep yet, she said. I hung his coat by the stove to thaw and sat down heavily at the table. Everything hurt in the imprecise, total way that deep cold brought on. Hands, shoulders, the back of his neck. He was 50% sure one of the fence sections in the east pasture had already come down. He was less sure about the condition of the cattle shelter. Clara put a bowl of soup in front of him. Not asking, just doing it. He ate without talking. She sat across from him with a cup of tea and the mending she always seemed to have somewhere nearby, and the blizzard battered the house from outside, throwing itself against the walls like something that wanted in, and inside the kitchen was warm and lit and quiet except for the howling. The sound bother you? He asked, meaning the storm. She didn't look up from her mending. I grew up in Cincinnati. She paused, listening to the wind do something particularly violent against the north wall. Yes, she said, which he appreciated more than if she'd said no. It's worse than it sounds, he said. Inside it sounds like noise. Outside it's like moving through something solid. Have you been caught in one? Outside? Once, 12 years ago, before I had the sense to watch the sky properly. He pushed his empty bowl aside. Lasted 4 hours. I dug into a snowbank behind a rock and waited. She looked up at that. How cold was it? 30 below, maybe more. He shrugged. You stop feeling cold after a while. That's the dangerous part. She was quiet for a moment. That's a terrible story. I survived it. I noticed, she said, and there was something dry in it that wasn't quite humor but was the relative of humor, and he almost laughed, which surprised him enough that he covered it by picking up his coffee cup. The blizzard ran 2.5 days. They were confined to the house for most of the second day, when the wind made crossing the yard to the barn a genuine risk of getting turned around in the whiteout and losing your sense of direction 10 feet from the door. Emilio and Dusty were in the bunkhouse, which was well stocked and sturdy, and Pete was with them. Wade made the barn run 3 times that day, quick, brutal trips with a rope tied from the back door to the barn door so he could follow it back, and came in from each one half frozen. Each time Clara was there when he came back. Not hovering, not performing concern, just present, with the towel, with the coffee, moving aside to let him at the stove, going back to what she was doing. It was matter of fact, the way she took care of things. Like it was simply what you did when someone came in from the cold. On the second afternoon, the worst of it, when the wind was shaking the house hard enough to rattle the lamp chimneys and the temperature outside had dropped to something that didn't bear calculating, Wade was sitting at the table going over his tallying books, and Clara was baking bread. The third batch, because baking was apparently what she did with her hands when she was managing stress. And she said, without looking up from the dough, Can I ask you something? He looked up. You can ask. The woman in the parlor. A pause. The kneading continued, steady. The sewing basket that nobody touches. Was she your wife? He was quiet for long enough that she added, You don't have to. Margaret, he said. Yes. The bread dough, the sound of the wind, the lamp. How long ago? She asked. 3 years? Almost 3.5. He looked at the tallying book without seeing it. Fever. It came fast and fast. I'm sorry, Clara said, and she meant it the way people mean it when they've lost someone themselves. Not the polite kind, the real kind. She'd have liked you, he said, before he thought about whether to say it. Clara's hand stilled on the dough. He hadn't planned to say it, and now that it was out there, he wasn't sure what to do with it, so he went back to his tallying book, and she went back to her bread. And the storm continued its assault on the walls, and neither of them said anything else about it. But something had shifted in the room. Not dramatically. Nothing you could point to, just the way the quality of a silence can change when something real has been said in it. The cattle losses from the blizzard were bad but not catastrophic. 7 head in the east pasture where the shelter had indeed come down in the night. 3 more in the north field. Wade found them when the storm broke and he went out to assess. The morning air scrubbed clean and brilliant and absolutely merciless in its cold clarity. He stood in the east pasture looking at the loss and did the math in his head. The rancher's math. The calculation of what this cost and what it meant for the winter and what adjustments needed making. It wasn't the worst outcome. He'd seen worse. He'd survive it. He came back to the house and told Clara the number, because she managed the provisions and needed to know. And she noted it with the same practical attention she gave everything. Then she said, "Sit down." He looked at her. "You've been on your feet since 4 this morning and 20 below," she said. "Sit down and eat something." He sat down. She put scrambled eggs in front of him. Real eggs. From the 3 hens she'd somehow kept alive and productive through the cold spell by moving their small pen into the barn and negotiating some arrangement with them that Wade didn't ask about. And toast. And he ate. And she sat across from him with her own plate. And outside the world was ruined and white and starting, very slowly, to be survivable again. He looked at her across the table, and she looked back, and there was the kind of eye contact that lasts a beat too long. Not on purpose, or not entirely, before both of them looked away. Wade picked up his fork. "Good eggs," he said. "The hens object to the cold," she said, "but they're managing." "Like everyone," he said. She looked at him again, and this time she did smile, small and real, a crack in the careful composure she held in place most of the time, and it changed her whole face in a way he wasn't prepared for. He looked down at his eggs. The day outside was brutal and white and enormous, and the ranch was still standing, and the stove was going, and there were scrambled eggs on the table, and Wade Coulter, who had been slowly disappearing into grief for 3 years, sat in his kitchen and felt the peculiar, uncomfortable, unwelcome, and absolutely undeniable sensation of wanting to stay. Not just in the chair, in all of it. He didn't examine that thought. He finished his eggs, thanked her, and went back out to deal with the fences. But the thought stayed where he'd left it, quiet and patient, waiting for him to be ready. The fences came down twice more in the 2 weeks after the blizzard, and both times Wade fixed them in the kind of cold that made the metal tools stick to bare skin if you weren't careful. He worked with Emilio mostly, the two of them moving across the frozen pastures with the post driver and wire, and the particular focused silence of men doing hard physical work in bad conditions. His hands were cracked at the knuckles, and one of the cracks had split deep enough to bleed, and he wrapped it with a strip of cloth in the morning and forgot about it by noon because there were always 12 other things demanding his attention. He didn't think about the moment with the scrambled eggs, mostly. He told himself, during the fence work and the barn runs and the livestock checks, that what he'd felt at that table was simply the natural result of isolation and winter, and having another human being present after years of deliberate aloneness. He told himself this was logical. He'd been alone too long and his judgment was off, and it would correct itself when spring came and the world opened back up, and he had normal human contact again and stopped reading, meaning into eye contact over breakfast. Emilio, who rode beside him on the fence line without speaking for long stretches the way good company does, looked at him once on the 3rd day and said, "You're thinking too hard about something." "I'm thinking about the east fence," Wade said. "No, you're not," Emilio said, and let it go. The thing about close quarters in winter was that you couldn't help but know a person. Not in the way you knew someone from deliberate conversations, from sitting across from them and asking careful questions. In the way you knew them from 100 small observations, the sound of them moving through the house before dawn, the specific way they held a coffee cup, the things that made them go quiet when they'd been talking, whether they sang to themselves when they thought no one was listening, what kept them up at night. Wade had learned, without intending to, that Clara was up before anyone else in the house. Not just before the ranch hands, before him, and he was up by 4:30. He'd come down at 5, expecting the kitchen to be dark and cold, and find the stove already going and the coffee already made, and Clara at the table with a candle, writing in a small book she closed quickly when she heard him on the stairs. He'd never mentioned the book. She'd never explained it. He'd learned that she was afraid of something she wouldn't name. Not the storm afraid, not the practical, manageable fear that everyone felt when the weather turned murderous. Something older and quieter. He could see it sometimes in the way she moved through a room when she didn't know he was watching, a kind of vigilance, like someone who'd learned that comfortable situations could turn on you without warning. She checked the locks on the back door before bed. Every night. He'd learned that she had a scar along the inside of her left forearm, maybe 4 inches long, that she covered with her sleeve the way people cover things they don't want questions about. He hadn't asked. She hadn't offered. By Christmas Eve, the worst of the winter cold had settled into something more manageable, Still brutal by most standards, but the kind of brutal that a well-run ranch could work inside of. The cattle were holding, the structures were holding. Wade had lost more than he wanted, but less than he'd feared, and the arithmetic of the season was coming out on the survivable side of the ledger, which was all you could really ask for. He came in from the barn that evening to find the kitchen transformed. Clara had done something he hadn't anticipated and couldn't have explained she was going to do. She'd cut pine branches from the tree line at the edge of the property. He could see her tracks in the snow going out and coming back, and arranged them along the kitchen windowsill and the mantel in the parlor. The smell hit him when he opened the back door, pine and wood smoke, and the unmistakable sharp sweetness of something with cinnamon cooking on the stove. She'd found his mother's tin star ornaments somewhere. He didn't know where, hadn't seen them in years, had assumed they were lost, and hung 3 of them from the pine branches with lengths of red thread. He stood in the doorway, still in his outdoor coat, and looked at it. Pete found the ornaments in the storage room, Clara said from the stove. She had her back to him, stirring something. I hope that's all right. I can put them back if... It's fine, he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. She turned part way, reading him, then turned back to the stove. Sit down, she said. Supper's close. Pete and Dusty and Emilio came in from the bunkhouse for Christmas Eve supper, stomping snow off their boots and looking at the pine branches with varying degrees of appreciation. Pete with open delight. Dusty with the pleased embarrassment of a man who doesn't want to admit he's touched. Emilio with the slight smile that was, for him, equivalent to anyone else breaking into song. Clara had made a ham she'd been working on for 2 days, and sweet potatoes, and something with dried apples and brown sugar that had been sending signals across the yard all afternoon. It was the fullest the table had been since Wade could remember. After supper, Pete tried to start a card game, and Dusty told him nobody wanted to lose money on Christmas Eve, and they argued about this in a way that was entirely habitual and mostly affectionate, until Emilio suggested they go back to the bunkhouse before the argument became genuine. They went, with a great deal of boot stomping and coat collecting, and Pete announcing to anyone who'd listen that Miss Whitmore's apple thing was the finest dessert he'd had in his life. The door shut behind them, and the kitchen went quiet. Wade was still at the table. Clara was clearing plates with the efficient movements of someone who'd been on her feet for hours and wasn't going to admit it. He got up and started stacking things for her, and she let him do it without comment, which meant she was tired. When she didn't have the energy to deflect help, it was because she'd run through her reserves. You should sit down, he said. I'll sit when this is done. Clara, sit down. I'll finish clearing. She turned around. There was a moment where she was going to argue, and then something in her posture shifted the way a held breath releases, and she sat down at the table and folded her hands in front of her and stared at them. He cleared the plates, found 2 cups, poured the last of the coffee, set one in front of her, and sat down across from her with the candle between them and the pine smell in the air and the wind doing its quiet, ceaseless work outside. She said, I need to tell you something. Her voice was steady, but steady in the way things are steady when they're working at it. He waited. She picked up her cup, put it down. When you hired me in Black Creek, she said, I let you assume things. About my situation. About why I was there. You didn't tell me anything, he said. I didn't ask. I know, but She stopped, started again. I told you a man abandoned me during the journey west. That's true. His name was Gerald Marsh. He had money and a plan to start a business in Oregon, and he came through Cincinnati talking about a new life, and a breath. I was not smart about it. I believed what I wanted to believe. We traveled together for 6 weeks, and when we reached the Montana Territory, he decided I was more trouble than I'd worth, and he left. Left me with what I could carry and about 40 cents. I know, Wade said quietly. She looked up. You knew? People in Black Creek talk, he said. I knew the basic shape of it. I didn't need the details. She looked at him for a moment. Something moved through her expression that he couldn't quite name. Then she said, There's more than the basic shape. He was quiet, listening. Before Gerald, she said, before the whole catastrophic business of trying to go west, I was in Cincinnati for 2 years, and before that, another city. She turned her cup slowly in her hands. When my father died, I was 17 and there wasn't money, and my mother she wasn't well. Not in the way that gets better. I needed work, and the work available to a girl with no particular credentials who needed to eat was... She paused. I worked in saloons, 3 different ones over 4 years. I want to be clear about what I mean. I worked in the kitchen, mostly. Some of it was serving drinks. Some of it was. She stopped again. It wasn't always work I'm proud of. It was work I survived. The candle flame moved in a small draft. Men used to. Her jaw tightened. The things people say to a woman in a saloon, the things they say when she's large and they think that means she should be grateful for any attention at all. She wasn't looking at him now. She was looking at a fixed point somewhere past his shoulder. I learned to take it because you take it, or you leave, and leaving means not eating. I learned to make myself. She shook her head. Smaller, quieter. I learned to not fight back because fighting back made it worse. A pause. Gerald was the first man in years who talked to me like I was a person worth talking to, so I trusted him, which was. She let out a short breath through her nose. Stupid. Not stupid, Wade said. Understandable. It was stupid, she said, flat. Not arguing, just accurate. I knew things about men by that point. I chose to unknow them. She looked at him directly. I'm telling you this because you have been decent to me since the day you hired me, and you've asked nothing I wasn't willing to give, and I've been. Her voice thinned slightly. I've been waiting for you to figure out some version of the truth and use it against me. And you haven't. And I think you deserve to know who you have in your house. He sat with that for a moment. The fire in the stove ticked. The candle flame settled. Is there anything in what you just told me, he said, that changes the work you do here? She looked at him. Does it change the way you run this house, or handle the provisions, or manage the men, or do the 100 other things you do every day that keep this ranch from falling apart? No, she said carefully. Then I don't see what I'm supposed to do with it except say that I'm sorry you went through it, he said. And I'm glad you're here instead of somewhere worse. She was very still. That's it, she said. That's it. She pressed her lips together. There was a brightness at the edge of her eyes that she would not let go further, and he looked at the candle to give her the privacy of not being watched. The women in this town, she said after a moment, voice under control again, the way they talk about me, I think some of it is, they can tell, that I've been somewhere they wouldn't go. They can smell it on me somehow. They talk about you because you came from outside and you're different, and it's a small town in winter, he said. They'd find a reason regardless. Maybe, she said. It's not a maybe. She looked at the pine branches on the windowsill. Your wife, she said carefully. When you say she would have liked me, you mean it? I mean it, he said. Margaret had no patience for performance. She liked people who were real about things. She'd have respected you. Clara was quiet for a long moment. That means something to me, she said. I don't entirely know why. Because she mattered, he said simply. The clock in the hall said it was past 9. The wind had dropped to something almost gentle. Through the kitchen window, the snow was catching the light from inside and glowing faintly, the yard transformed by it into something almost peaceful. Wade looked at Clara across the candlelit table, at the scars she kept covered, and the careful way she held herself, and the intelligence she rationed out, and the stubbornness that ran through her like a seam of iron, and felt something come clear in him with the specific quality of things that have been true for a while finally being admitted. He was in love with her. Not in the soft, uncomplicated way of young men, not in the way that ignores difficulty and consequence. In the hard, grown-up way that comes from watching someone be real every day, that comes from recognizing something in another person that you recognize in yourself. The damage and the determination both, and finding, against all your better instincts, that you don't want to look away from it. I was in love with Clara Whitmore, and it was a terrible idea, and he'd been fighting it since approximately the second week of November. He was done fighting it. He said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to hear it as a genuine question and not as something else. She went still. I know what people are saying about you in town, he said. I know what they're saying about both of us. I also know that you've been living in this house for nearly 2 months on a housekeeper's arrangement that was never designed to be permanent, and I've been. He stopped, started again. I've been putting off saying this because I didn't know how to say it without making you think I was taking advantage of your situation. So I'm going to say it plainly, and you can tell me plainly what you think. She was watching him with that guarded look, the one she used when she was waiting to be disappointed. I would like to marry you, he said. The kitchen was very quiet. I'm not saying that because of the gossip, he said. I'm not saying it because it would be convenient. I'm saying it because I have spent 2 months watching who you are, and I'd like to keep watching for considerably longer, and I'd like you to be here next winter and the one after that. Because this house was dying before you came, and I was, he looked at the table. I was disappearing. And you stopped that from happening, and I don't think you even know you did it. Clara said nothing. I know I'm not. He gestured at himself, the way a man does when he's trying to describe something he can't fully see. I know I'm difficult. I don't talk enough. I work too much. I'm still. A pause. I'm still grieving Margaret in ways I don't have good words for. I'm not offering you something easy. She said, Do you think what I'm offering is easy? No, he said. I have a past that this town will use against both of us, she said. I have no family, no property, no connections that would benefit you in any practical sense. The only thing I have is. She stopped. I don't know how to do this lightly, she said. I don't know how to do anything lightly. If I stay for good. That's. She shook her head. That's the only way I know how to do things. Good, he said. That's what I'm asking for. She looked at him for a long time. You're serious, she said. Clara, I am not a man who says things he doesn't mean. She looked at the candle, the pine branches, the tin star ornament strung with red thread. She looked at them for long enough that he thought she might be about to say something entirely different, something that would put the whole thing back where it had been and let them both go back to the careful arrangement they'd been maintaining. Then she said, I've loved you since the first night you pulled out the chair at the table and told me to sit down and eat with everyone else. Her voice was even, careful, like she was reading something she'd written and wasn't sure of. Not in the kitchen alone, at the table. Like I was. She stopped. Like it was normal. He looked at her. I've been waiting, she said, for you to realize what you had in the house and decide it wasn't worth the trouble. I realize what I have in the house, he said. She pressed her hands flat on the table. All right, she said. All right? All right, she said again, and this time it was different. Something released in it, some long-held tension finally allowed to go. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Just that. Just the weight of it, and she turned her hand under his and held on. Outside, the snow was still and the wind had dropped entirely, the way it sometimes did in Montana in the deep of winter, the cold settling into a kind of absolute quiet that wasn't peaceful exactly, but was something close to it. They married 3 days later in the small frontier church that doubled as a schoolhouse, on a Tuesday morning so cold that the pastor's breath clouded between every word of the ceremony. There were 9 people present, Emilio, Dusty, Pete, the pastor, and his wife, old Harlan Briggs, who'd come because he'd always had a soft spot for Wade, and didn't care what anyone thought, and 2 women from the edge of town who had watched the whole winter's proceedings with interest and come to their own conclusions about Clara Whitmore's character that differed sharply from the rest of Black Creek's. The rest of Black Creek watched from windows and doorways with the collective expression of people who had predicted something would go wrong and were still waiting. Clara wore her best dress, which was dark blue wool, and did not have a train or embroidery or any of the trappings the town might have expected. She carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers that Pete had found packed away in the storage room, the kind you pressed in a book in summer and forgot about. And she held them in both hands in front of her and kept her back straight and her eyes on Wade and did not look once at the people who weren't there. Wade had cleaned up better than anyone except Emilio had expected, in a dark suit he'd last worn to Margaret's funeral, and he stood at the front of that frozen church and watched Clara walk toward him, and felt, somewhere in the region where he'd been numb for 3 years, something that was nothing like numbness at all. The ceremony was short, practical. The pastor, who had known Wade long enough to know he was not a man for elaborate speeches, kept it to the essential and meaningful. When it was done, when Clara was Clara Coulter, by whatever combination of legal and spoken word makes such things real, Wade looked at her and she looked back at him, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then Pete, who had been vibrating with barely contained enthusiasm in the second row, let out a whoop that echoed off the church ceiling and made the pastor's wife jump, and Emilio laughed, a real full laugh that Wade hadn't heard from him in years. And Dusty clapped once, loud, and Clara turned her face against Wade's shoulder for just a second, hiding something. He put his hand on the back of her head briefly, just briefly. Outside, Black Creek went about its business in the cold, certain this marriage wouldn't survive the spring. Neither of them was thinking about Black Creek. Black Creek expected the marriage to collapse the way they expected most things they disapproved of to collapse, with a kind of patient, satisfied certainty, the way you wait for a fence post someone else put in crooked to eventually fall over. They gave it until spring thaw. Then they revised to summer. Then, when summer came and the double C was still standing and Clara Coulter was still very much present and not showing any signs of disappearing, they stopped making specific predictions and settled into a general, low-grade resentment that expressed itself in small ways. The cold shoulders at the general store. The conversations that stopped when Clara walked in. The particular way certain women in town looked at her. Not with open hostility anymore, which would have been easier, but with a measuring, suspicious attention, like they were still waiting to catch her at something. Clara noticed all of it and said nothing about it at home. This was the first real thing Wade learned about being married to her, as opposed to simply knowing her. She carried things alone by default, not out of martyrdom, not out of any desire to seem strong. It was simply the mechanism she'd built over years of having no one reliable to put things down with. She'd bring a practical problem to him immediately, directly, without ceremony. A fence contract dispute, a question about the spring cattle drive, a decision about which of the outbuildings needed repair first. Those she brought because they required two people. But the personal things, the small cruelties from town, the whispers, the accumulated weight of being not wanted in the place where you lived, those she folded up and put somewhere inside herself and didn't take out in front of anyone. He knew this because he recognized it. He did the same thing. It made for a marriage that was, in certain ways, unusual. They weren't talkers, either of them. The ranch house didn't fill up with long conversations or with the kind of deliberate emotional processing that some couples seem to require. What it filled up with was something harder to name. A quality of presence, of attention, of two people who were genuinely paying attention to each other without making a performance of it. He'd come in from work and she'd hand him coffee, and he'd stand in the kitchen and give her the summary of the day, not because he needed to unload, but because she was interested, because she asked the right questions, because talking to her about the ranch was the closest thing he'd found to thinking clearly about it. And she'd tell him about whatever she'd been working on, and he'd listen, and somewhere in the middle of all that functional exchange was the thing that actually mattered, which was that they were both, for the first time in a long time, not alone. It wasn't perfect. Nothing about it was perfect. Wade was difficult in all the ways he'd warned her he'd be. He went silent when he should have spoken. He had a temper that he kept well controlled most of the time, but that occasionally showed its edges, in the set of his jaw when something frustrated him, in the way he'd go out to the barn and work an extra 2 hours instead of saying what was wrong. He carried Margaret in ways that were sometimes visible, a shadow that passed over him at certain times of year, on certain dates, and Clara had learned to recognize those days and give him the space he needed without making him feel watched. She was difficult in her own ways. She didn't ask for help until she was already past needing it. She had a stubbornness that occasionally crossed into something more like pride, the kind that came from years of refusing to let anyone see her struggle. And there were times she'd be clearly exhausted or clearly hurting, and she'd insist she was fine with a conviction that was both entirely characteristic and entirely infuriating. She also, twice in those first months, packed her things, not to leave. Or he didn't know if she meant to leave. The first time was in April, after a particularly bad episode in town where Donnelly's wife had said something vicious in front of 3 other women, and Clara had come home with that flat, contained look that he'd learned meant she was managing something large. He'd found her in the bedroom with the worn suitcase open on the bed, folding things into it with the mechanical focus of someone running on pure self-preservation instinct. He'd stood in the doorway. She'd looked up and seen him, and gone still. "I don't know how to," she'd said, and stopped. Her hands were pressed flat on the folded blouse in the suitcase. "I keep waiting for the thing that makes this not work," she'd said, "and it doesn't come, and I don't know what to do with that." He'd stepped into the room, moved the suitcase to the floor without closing it, and sat on the edge of the bed. "Come sit down," he'd said. She'd sat. Not close, not leaning, just sat beside him on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap. "What did she say?" he asked. A long pause. "She said that the only reason you married me was because you'd lost your mind with grief, and that everyone knew it, and that when you came back to yourself you'd realize your mistake." He said nothing for a moment. "She said Margaret would be ashamed of you," Clara said, and her voice didn't change on it, which told him exactly how hard she was working. Margaret, he said, choosing his words carefully, would have told her to mind her own affairs in language that would have set the church on fire. He paused. She was not a gentle woman when provoked. Clara looked at him sideways. She would not, he said clearly, be ashamed of anything about this. Clara looked at her hands. You're not a mistake, he said. I need you to understand that. I don't mean that as a kindness. I mean it as a fact. This ranch is working better than it has in 4 years. I'm working better. You know that's true? She was quiet for a long time. Then she said roughly, I'm sorry about the suitcase. Leave it on the floor, he said. You can put it back in the closet when you're ready. She put it back in his closet that evening, and he never mentioned it, and they didn't talk about it again. The second time it came out was in August, after a bad night that started as a disagreement about the ranch accounts and became something messier, the kind of fight that wasn't about what it appeared to be about. That was about trust and fear and old damage. The kind of argument that two people with difficult histories have when they've gotten close enough that the difficult histories start to press against each other. He'd said something too sharp and she'd gone very quiet in the way that meant he'd hit something real, and he'd known immediately that he'd gone wrong but hadn't known how to turn it around. So he'd gone to the barn instead of fixing it and stayed too long. He'd come back to find the suitcase out again. He'd looked at it and looked at her and said, I'm sorry. What I said was wrong, and I knew it when I said it. She'd said, I don't know how to fight with someone who isn't trying to hurt me. He'd taken a moment to understand what she meant. I'm not trying to hurt you, he said. I was angry about the accounts, and I put it somewhere I shouldn't have. That's my fault. I know, she said. I know that here, she touched her temple, but here, she touched her chest. Here it took longer to arrive. He'd crossed the room and put the suitcase on the floor, and this time he'd sat close, and she'd leaned into him the way she almost never did, not performing need, just briefly allowing herself to have some. And they'd sat like that for a while, not talking, the summer dark outside the window, and the crickets going and the ranch doing its quiet nighttime sounds around them. The suitcase went back in the closet. It didn't come out again. The drought hit in the second year of their marriage, the summer of 1880, and it was the kind of drought that made men seriously consider whether Montana was trying to kill them personally. It started in June with a dry stretch that could have been normal, and then July arrived without a single meaningful rain, and by August the pastures were brown and cracking, and the creek that ran along the east edge of the property had dropped to a thin thread, and the cattle were showing it. Wade made hard decisions that summer, culling earlier than he wanted to, selling at prices that hurt, shifting the remaining herd to the north pasture where the grass held out longest. He worked from before light to after dark, and came home with dust in his teeth and his eyes red-rimmed from sun, and Clara could see him doing the math in his head constantly. The calculation every rancher did in bad years, the running tally of what you were losing against what you needed to survive. She had her own response to the drought that was typically Clara. She stopped spending money they didn't need to spend, started extending provisions in ways that required skill and creativity, and began reaching out to the other ranch wives, including several who'd been cold to her, about shared resources. Not with any sentimentality about it, purely practically. She'd ridden out one morning and come back to tell Wade that she'd arranged to share access to the Hendersons' deep well, which was still running, in exchange for Clara doing their preserving for the winter since Mrs. Henderson's hands had gotten bad with the joint pain. He'd stared at her. Maggie Henderson is not your friend, he said. No, Clara agreed, but her well is full and ours isn't. We can be friendly without being friends. He'd gone to the Henderson place that afternoon and shaken Roy Henderson's hand, and they'd agreed the terms, and the arrangement held through the dry summer and saved the Coulter herd from a loss that might have been critical. It was around this time that Black Creek began, very slowly and without anyone particularly admitting it, to revise its opinion. It didn't happen dramatically. It happened in the incremental, grudging way that opinion changes in small communities, one thing at a time, each too small to constitute a conversion, adding up over months to something different than what had been there before. It happened because Clara was visible in ways that were hard to dismiss. She was at the general store every week, and she paid her accounts on time, and she was civil to people who hadn't been civil to her. She was at the church on the Sundays when Wade agreed to go, sitting in the third pew, and she didn't flinch from anyone's gaze. She helped Nora Patterson get her wagon out of a ditch on the main road in September without being asked, and without making anything of it. And Nora Patterson was someone whose opinion moved other opinions in Black Creek in the way that rivers move everything downstream. But the thing that actually changed things, the real turning point, happened in October. A fire broke out in the Briggs family's storage barn. It went fast, the way fires go in October in a dry year, and by the time the bucket line formed from the creek, it was already clear the structure was lost. What wasn't clear, for about 20 minutes, was whether old Harlan Briggs's wife was in there, because she'd been seen going in that direction and no one could find her. She was at a neighbor's house and had been for an hour, and the fire burned itself out against the stone foundation without taking anything except 2 months of winter feed and some equipment. But in those 20 minutes, before anyone knew, Clara Coulter had been the first person through the nearest fence gate carrying a wet blanket and heading toward the smoke. Not the first woman. The first person. She hadn't found Mrs. Briggs. But she'd found Harlan Briggs himself, 71 years old with a bad hip, trying to get into the burning structure alone, and she'd physically stopped him and held him back while the building went, and she'd stood with him while it burned and said nothing, just stayed there with her hand on his arm, until his sons came and took over. Wade heard about it from Emilio, who'd been in town when it happened. He hadn't been there himself. He'd been on the far north pasture and gotten back too late. He'd asked Clara about it at supper. She'd shrugged. Someone had to stop him from going in. You could have... He stopped. She could have gotten hurt. That was what he was going to say. She looked at him. But I didn't, she said. No, he said. You didn't. She passed him the bread. What he didn't say, because he didn't have good words for it, and she would have been embarrassed by it, was that he'd been watching her for nearly 2 years accumulate the kind of credibility that no argument could build, the kind that came from just being who you were, consistently, when it cost you something. The town of Black Creek had told her, from the day she arrived, that she didn't belong there. She'd never argued with them about it. She'd just kept being present, kept doing the work, kept showing up. And the town was slowly, quietly, running out of reasons to maintain its position. The news that Clara was pregnant came in November of 1880, 2 years after Wade had hired her off a bench in the cold. She told him on a morning when the first real snow of the season was coming down outside the kitchen window, sitting across from him at the table the way they sat every morning with their coffee, and she said it plainly, the way she said most important things, without preamble or performance, just the fact. I think I'm pregnant, she said. He put down his cup. The doctor in Billings could confirm it, she said, but I'm fairly certain. He looked at her. She was watching him with that careful attention, that reading the room quality she still had, still waiting for the reaction to tell her what was true. How do you feel? He asked. She blinked, like it wasn't the question she'd expected. Tired, she said, and sick in the mornings. Is that normal? Apparently, yes. I was quiet for a moment, processing something that was large and complicated and that he wasn't going to get through in one sitting. The last time there'd been talk of children, Margaret, years ago. A conversation they'd had twice, and that had never come to anything before she got sick. It had lived in him as a particular kind of grief. The grief of things that don't happen. He'd packed it away with everything else from that time. It had apparently not stayed packed. We should get you to Billings, he said, before the real cold comes. She nodded. Then, Wade. He looked up. Are you... She turned her cup in her hands. Is this... Clara, he said. I'm sitting here trying to remember how to breathe. That's a good sign. She looked at him for a moment. Something in her face shifted. The guarded thing that was always there at some level. Even now, even 2 years in, letting go of its grip just slightly. All right, she said. All right, he said. He reached across the table the way he had on Christmas Eve 2 years ago and put his hand over hers. She turned hers over and held on. They went to Billings the following week, and the doctor confirmed it, and Clara handled the doctor's various opinions. He was the kind of man who had a great many opinions about what women in her condition should and shouldn't do, with a polite, total indifference that Wade found deeply satisfying to watch. On the drive back, the mountains enormous and white on both sides, and the sky doing the particular deep blue it did in November above the snow line, she asked him something she'd apparently been holding for a while. Do you want a boy or a girl? He thought about it honestly. I don't have a preference, he said. I want one that's healthy. That's a very practical answer. I'm a practical person. She looked at the mountains. Me too, she said. I keep trying to be frightened about it, and mostly I'm just... She paused. Determined. That tracks, he said. She looked at him. Is that a criticism? It's an observation, he said. You're the most determined person I've ever met. That seems like a good quality in a mother. She looked back at the mountains with the expression she wore when something had landed somewhere she hadn't defended against. The baby came in August, in the middle of a thunderstorm that had been building all day and finally broke around 10 in the evening with the specific violence of Montana in summer. Lightning down the mountains, thunder that shook the windows, rain coming sideways against the glass. Wade had sent for the doctor from Black Creek in the afternoon, and by some combination of luck and the doctor's aging but reliable horse, she made it to the ranch by nightfall. Wade spent 3 hours in the parlor while Clara was upstairs, and those were among the longest 3 hours he could remember. He didn't pray. He paced. He sat, and then stood, and then paced again, and Emilio sat with him without speaking, which was exactly what was needed. The storm and the birth finished at roughly the same time. The doctor came downstairs and told him it was a boy, that Clara was exhausted but fine, and that he could go up. He went up. Clara was in the bed with the particular demolished look of someone who has been through something large and come out the other side. Her hair was loose and damp, and her face was gray-pale with exhaustion, and she was looking down at the bundle in her arms with an expression he'd never seen on her before, something completely unguarded, completely without defense, all the way open. She looked up when he came in. "He's got your eyes," she said. Her voice was wrecked. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son for the first time. The baby was small and red-faced and furious-looking in the way of new babies, with a faint dark hair and eyes squinted against the lamplight. He was, objectively, not remarkable-looking. Wade was aware he was supposed to think otherwise, and also aware that he was entirely beyond objectivity on the subject, because something was happening in his chest that had no name he could reach. He took the baby when Clara held him out, carefully, the way you handle something irreplaceable, and sat with him, and outside the storm was breaking apart into the clean air that came after Montana thunder. And he looked at this person who hadn't existed 9 months ago and felt something he hadn't felt in years and years, something that had nothing to do with surviving and everything to do with the future. His eyes went wet. He didn't try to stop it. Clara watched him from the pillow, her exhausted face completely calm, and she didn't say anything, and she didn't need to. They named him James Wade Coulter. Pete cried when he heard, which he denied later, and which everyone who'd been present denied having seen out of collective kindness. Emilio shook Wade's hand and held it for a moment, which from Emilio carried the weight of a speech. Dusty brought a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for an occasion and declared that this was the occasion. Black Creek heard the news, and the reaction was complicated in the way that Black Creek's reactions to the Coulters always were. Some genuine warmth from the people who'd shifted their position, some sour recalibration from the ones who hadn't, and from the majority that pragmatic middle ground acknowledgement that this marriage was real and was not going away, and that the Coulter Ranch was not, as predicted, failing. It was doing the opposite. What nobody in Black Creek had fully calculated, in their original dismissal of Clara Whitmore as a liability, was that she had something rarer and more valuable than the things they'd thought she lacked. She had the ability to see a whole operation, its weaknesses, its inefficiencies, its overlooked possibilities, the way someone who'd had to survive on limited resources learns to see waste. She'd been quietly, steadily improving the Double C's operations for 2 years in ways that showed up in the accounts, but that Wade, who was a rancher and not a businessman, couldn't have managed alone. She'd renegotiated their arrangement with the buyer who took their beef, pointing out leverage in the contract that the buyer had been counting on them not to notice. She'd suggested adding a small dairy operation that provided winter income when the cattle money was thin. She'd pushed for an agreement with a neighboring ranch to share the cost of a decent bull, which improved the herd quality in a way that showed in the prices they got the following year. The Double C had been a struggling, barely surviving operation when she arrived. 2 years later, it was one of the more stable spreads in the valley. Wade knew it. Emilio knew it. The accounts knew it. The town of Black Creek was beginning to understand it. But what mattered more to Wade than any of it, more than the improved accounts, or the stable operation, or even the slow, grudging shift in the town's opinion, happened on a Sunday afternoon in late autumn, when the light came down through the kitchen window in that particular slanted way it had in October, the long golden light before the dark came early, and he came inside from the barn to find Clara at the table with James on her lap. The boy was 4 months old and deeply interested in the world in the way of babies that age, reaching for things, startling himself with his own sounds. Clara was doing the accounts with one hand, the pen moving down the ledger column, and with the other she was holding his small fist, and she was talking to him quietly as she worked. Not baby talk, just talking, narrating what she was doing in the calm, practical voice she used for everything. She didn't hear Wade come in. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the two of them in the slanted October light, the ranch house around them solid and warm and full of the smell of the soup she had going on the back of the stove and the sound of the pen in the ledger and the baby's commentary on existence. And he stood there and understood something in a complete, finished way that he'd been approaching from various directions for 2 years. He had not expected any of this. He had expected to work the ranch until he couldn't work it anymore, and then to be finished. He had not expected warmth. He had not expected partnership, or the particular way Clara's mind worked, or the way she made everything she touched more real. He had not expected his own capacity to feel things to come back online after 3 years of absence. He had not expected his son. Clara looked up and saw him in the doorway and said, "Soup's in an hour. How's the north fence?" "Needs work," he said. "It always needs work," she said, and went back to her ledger. He hung up his coat and washed his hands and went and sat at the table, and James, spotting him from his mother's lap, made a sound of energetic recognition that did something entirely unreasonable to Wade's chest, and Wade held out a finger and the boy grabbed it with both hands, with the ferocious, determined grip of someone who intended to hold on. He let himself be held. James learned to walk in the spring of 1881, lurching across the kitchen floor with the reckless commitment of someone who had not yet been properly introduced to gravity, and Wade caught him so many times in a single afternoon that his back ached the next morning. Clara watched from the table with her coffee cup, and the particular expression she wore when something was simultaneously amusing and important, that small, contained smile that she still didn't give away easily, even after 3 years, even in her own kitchen. "He's going to fall," Wade said, catching him again. "He knows," Clara said. "He doesn't care." That was true. James got up every time with the same furious determination, made it 2 or 3 steps further than the last attempt, and fell again with a look of profound personal offense, like the floor had broken a promise. He was, at 11 months, already recognizable as the sum of both his parents, Wade's stubbornness running through him like a current, Clara's intelligence visible in the way he watched things before he tried them, the careful observation before the action. How was, in the way of things you don't expect and don't deserve, the best thing Wade Coulter had ever had a hand in. The years that followed. James didn't simplify. They expanded, which is a different thing, and expansion brings its own kind of difficulty. More to protect, more to lose, more ways for things to go wrong. A second child came in 1883, a girl they named Ruth, who arrived with considerably less drama than James and considerably more opinions, which she expressed clearly and at volume from approximately the 3rd day of her life. Wade looked at his daughter in those early weeks with an expression Emilio described privately to Dusty, as a man who has walked into a room and discovered the furniture has been rearranged in a way that makes more sense than what was there before and doesn't know how to admit it. Ruth was, from the beginning, Clara's daughter in her bones. The way she watched adults for the truth underneath what they were saying. The way she held her ground. At 3 years old, she told Wade, calmly and without apparent malice, that he was wrong about which of the barn cats had kittens hidden in the hayloft, and she was correct, and Wade told her she was right with the same directness he'd use with anyone, and Clara, watching from the doorway, felt something settle in her that she hadn't known was still unsettled. Her own father had never told her she was right about anything. That was the thing about watching Wade with the children that kept catching Clara in unguarded moments, the unthinking equity of it. He didn't talk down to them or talk over them. He explained things like they were capable of understanding, listened to their questions like they were worth answering, held them accountable in the even way you hold someone accountable when you respect them. He was not a demonstrative man. He didn't overflow with affection, didn't do the elaborate displays that some fathers performed, but he was present in a way that Clara had learned was far rarer and far more valuable. She'd grown up largely invisible. Her size, her father's drinking, the family's poverty, the relentless message from every direction that she was too much of some things and not enough of others. It had made her over years into someone who expected to be overlooked. 19 years of that kind of conditioning doesn't disappear because one person treats you differently. She knew that. She'd learned that the hard way in the early years of the marriage, discovering that being loved didn't automatically mean knowing how to receive it. There were still mornings when she'd wake at 4 and lie in the dark cataloging what could go wrong. Not anxious exactly, more like the old watchfulness that had kept her alive for years and didn't know how to stand down, but the years had worn it down, the way water wears stone. Gradually, without announcement, the Double C grew through the early 1880s into something that required more hands and more structures and more decisions than Wade could manage alone, even with Clara's help. And the decisions they made together, which direction to expand, what stock to invest in, which neighboring operations to build relationships with, shaped the valley around them in ways that wouldn't be fully visible for another decade. Wade had the rancher's instincts, the knowledge of land and animal and weather that came from 20 years of paying attention. Clara had something harder to name, a strategic intelligence, a sense of systems, the ability to look at what they had and see what it could become if you removed the right obstacle or made the right connection. Between the two of them, they built something that neither would have built alone, and they both knew it, and they'd stopped pretending otherwise somewhere around the 4th year of the marriage. The trouble with Donnelly came to a head in the summer of 1884. It had been building for years, slow and low grade, the accumulated weight of his particular variety of dislike, which had never fully resolved despite the pressure Wade had applied back in the first winter. Donnelly had kept his distance and kept his opinions mostly private after that early confrontation, but he'd been quietly working against the Double C in ways that were hard to prove and easy to feel. A word here to a potential buyer, a suggestion there to a rancher who might have otherwise been an ally. The kind of undermining that happens in a small community when someone with local influence decides they want you to fail. It came to open conflict over water rights on a stretch of creek that ran along the boundary between the Donnelly spread and the Double C's east pasture. The creek had always been shared by informal agreement, the kind of arrangement that worked fine until it didn't, and what made it stop working was a dry spell in June of '84 that made the water in that stretch critical for the Coulter herd. Donnelly had his men divert it, not legally. There was no legal basis for what he did, and he probably knew it, but practically. And in ranching, what's practical often outruns what's legal by long enough to cause serious damage. Wade found out on a Tuesday afternoon when Emilio rode back from the east pasture with the report, and the conversation at the supper table that night was the kind of conversation that kept the children quiet, the kind where the adults' voices stayed level in a specific, deliberate way that was worse, somehow, than shouting would have been. "He's counting on you riding over there tonight and doing something you'll regret," Clara said. Wade looked at her across the table. "That's the plan," she said. "You go over, it gets physical, he presses charges or shoots you or both, and the court sorts it out while the Double C loses its east pasture herd." She'd put her fork down. "He doesn't want your water. He wants you to be stupid about it." Wade looked at his plate. "I know that." "Then, I know that," he said, and his voice was tight enough that James, who was 3 and reading the room with his mother's instincts, quietly moved closer to Ruth on the bench. "I went to Black Creek in the morning, not to Donnelly's, to the land office, where the water rights for the valley were on file, and then to the office of the single lawyer who'd set up practice in town 6 months earlier, a young man from Missouri named Haverford, who everyone had so far regarded as an interesting curiosity rather than an actual resource. Wade and Clara had read him differently. They'd had 2 conversations with him over the winter and concluded he was competent, and more importantly was not yet in anyone's pocket. The case took 3 months and was not painless. The legal fees were a real cost, the uncertainty was a real stress, and Donnelly made things as difficult as he could by knowing the local territory better than any legal document. But the water rights were, on examination, clear. The diversion was illegal. The order to restore the creek to its natural course came down in September, and Donnelly complied because complying was less expensive than not complying, and he did it with a bad grace that satisfied no one, including himself. He didn't speak to the Coulters after that. This was not, as far as either of them was concerned, a loss. What the conflict did accomplish, inadvertently, was to finalize something that had been gradually resolving in Black Creek's collective opinion for years. Watching Clara Coulter in those 3 months, watching her manage the household and the ranch and the legal situation and the children simultaneously, watching her talk to Haverford with the ease of someone who'd read every document twice and could discuss the specifics, watching her handle the anxiety of the town's speculation with the same impenetrable composure she'd walked into that town with 6 years earlier. Something settled. Not everyone. Some people in Black Creek would have required a personal apology from the universe before they revised their opinions of Clara Coulter, and the universe was not in the habit of providing those. But enough people. The weight shifted. Nora Patterson said something at the general store that got repeated. Whatever you think about how it started, that woman holds that ranch together. Anyone who looks can see it. Anyone who looked could see it. The years stacked up in the way that years do when you're inside them. Not as a progression exactly, more as layers, each one adding something that changed the shape of everything underneath. Pete eventually left. He was 31 and wanted his own spread, which was the right decision and which Clara had been gently pushing him toward for 2 years. He went to northern Montana with their blessing and a small sum that they categorically refused to call what it was, and he categorically refused to accept until Clara told him plainly that she'd spent 4 years watching him work, and this was his earned portion, full stop. He cried at the kitchen table, which he denied, and rode north in the spring of 1886. Dusty's knee finally gave out the following year, the one he'd been medicating with Clara's wordless liniment for 5 years. And he took a room above the general store in Black Creek and became, somewhat to everyone's surprise, a person who watched over the town, the way a retired sheepdog watches a yard, not in charge, but paying attention. He came to Sunday dinners at the Double C so reliably that his absence would have been alarming. Emilio stayed. Emilio would stay until there was no more ranch to stay at, which was the kind of loyalty that exists entirely outside of employment arrangements and can't be manufactured or replaced. He and Wade grew into the kind of friendship that doesn't require maintenance. They could go 3 weeks without a real conversation and pick up exactly where they'd been, and they understood each other in the specific way that men who've worked hard country together for years understand each other, which is at a level below words. Clara and Emilio had their own understanding, quieter and less visible, that had grown out of those first weeks when she'd been finding her footing, and he'd been watching her with that steady, measuring attention. He'd told Wade back then that she was the real thing. He'd never revised that opinion, and she'd somehow known it from almost the beginning, had known he was a person she could trust, which was not something she said or showed, but which shaped how she moved around him, a slight ease that wasn't there with most people. James grew into the kind of boy who made his parents look at each other sometimes in a specific way. The look that means, where did he come from in the best possible sense? He had Wade's physical presence and Clara's mind and some third thing that was entirely his own, a quality of warmth that neither of them would have claimed as their contribution, and that made people around him feel, reliably, that things were going to be all right. He was good with horses in the way his father had been, and good with numbers in the way his mother was, and by 14 was doing real work on the ranch and doing it well. Ruth was more complicated, which was how Clara privately put it, and Wade didn't disagree. She was brilliant, and she knew it, and she had opinions about everything, and a tongue that could be devastating when she was pushed, and she did not suffer fools, which made her occasionally difficult and permanently interesting. She and Wade had shouting arguments that Clara stayed entirely out of, not because she was afraid of them, but because they seemed to serve a function. Two people who were fundamentally alike working out the terms of relating to each other, and they always resolved into something more solid than what had been there before. Clara loved both of her children with the specific, complicated love of a person who had never expected to have children at all. Not the easy, romantic idea of motherhood, but the real thing, which was harder and stranger and more total than she'd been prepared for. There were days she was short with them when she shouldn't have been, days when the weight of everything sat on her in ways she couldn't explain, and she was distant when they needed her present. She was not a perfect mother, she was a real one, and the distinction mattered. The 20th anniversary of their marriage fell on a Tuesday in January of 1899, and it went essentially unremarked because they were both the kind of people who found that sort of ceremony uncomfortable, and neither of them had suggested anything. It was a normal Tuesday, Wade in the barn from 4:30, Clara managing the books and the household, and the fact that James's wife Annie had just had their first grandchild, a development that had thoroughly disorganized both grandparents in ways neither of them would admit. It was in the evening, with the children gone to their own lives, and the house quieter than it had been for years, that they found themselves on the porch in the cold, the way old habits find you, not by decision but by accumulation, just the place they ended up when the work was done. The mountains were going dark, the last of the light holding at the peaks, the sky behind them doing the deep blue into black that Wade had watched from this property for over 20 years, and Clara had watched for 19. They sat in the two chairs that had replaced the original porch bench sometime in the late 1880s, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, not quite close enough to touch, because that was how they'd always sat out here, and you didn't change things that worked. Clara had a cup of tea. Wade had coffee. The cold was real but not dangerous, the kind of cold that required a good coat and gave you something in return. The clarity of frozen air, the way sound carried across frozen ground, the stars coming out with that Montana density that people from cities couldn't believe. He said, "I want to tell you something." She looked at him. "I've been trying to figure out how to say it for a while." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Maybe 20 years. That's a long time to think about something," she said. "I'm a slow thinker." She almost smiled. He looked at the mountains. "When you came here," he said, I don't know exactly what I was. I thought I was managing, keeping the ranch going, keeping myself functional. I thought that was enough, to keep things functional." He paused. "I didn't understand what I'd lost until it started coming back." She was quiet, listening. She'd learned over 20 years that when he started to speak this way, slowly, like he was choosing each word from a limited supply, you didn't interrupt, because interrupting would cause him to stop, and he might not start again. "The town saw you as unwanted," he said. "I knew that when I hired you. I could see what they saw. A woman who didn't fit the picture they had in their heads of what a woman out here should look like, who'd been abandoned and had nothing, who came from somewhere difficult." He looked at his coffee cup. "And I keep thinking about what would have happened if I'd ridden past." Clara's hands were still around her tea. "If I'd kept my head down and ridden past," he said, "the way I'd been keeping my head down for 3 years. If I'd done what made sense, what was efficient, what didn't involve anyone else's problem." He shook his head. "I'd have died out here eventually. Not from the cold or the cattle or the work. From the—" He stopped. "From the absence of everything. I was disappearing, Clara. I was disappearing, and I didn't know it because you don't know what you're losing while you're losing it," she said carefully. "Wade, I know you know this," he said. "I'm not saying it because you don't know. I'm saying it because I've never said it, and 20 years is long enough not to say something." She turned to look at him fully. "You saved this place," he said. "But the place is wood and stone and land. You saved me. That's the different thing." The mountains held the last of the light. Clara looked at him with an expression he could read now in a way he hadn't been able to in the beginning. She was moved, genuinely moved, and she was also working to hold her composure, which was so completely her that he felt something pull in his chest, with the particular tenderness of knowing someone completely. "You stopped for me," she said, "in the cold, with the whole town watching. You stopped and looked at me like I was a person worth looking at." Her voice was steady, but only just. "Do you know how long it had been since anyone did that?" He didn't answer, because the answer was implied and it was too large. "I had given up," she said. "I didn't know I had, but I had. I was sitting on that bench and I'd made a kind of peace with the fact that this was it, that this was as far as things went for me. A woman like me, from where I'd been, with no—" She stopped, steadied herself. "And you stopped. You were sitting straight," he said. "That bench, with those men laughing at you, and your back was straight." "That was stubbornness," she said, "not strength." "I'm not sure there's a difference," he said. She looked at the mountains. "I used to think about what my life would have been," she said, "before you. The trajectory. Where it was going." A pause. "I stopped thinking about it after a while because thinking about it was—" She shook her head. "But sometimes I still catch a glimpse of it. Some version of me still on that bench, or somewhere worse. And I think about how thin it was, how close." She looked at him. "A different afternoon, and you don't ride through town. A different day, and I'm somewhere I can't get out of. That woman on the bench," he said, "would have found a way out, eventually." "Maybe," she said, "but not here, not this. This." The word carried everything. The house behind them, the mountains in front, the children who were grown and becoming themselves. The grandchild who had Wade's name in his name and Clara's stubbornness in his small face. The 20 years of mornings with coffee and hard seasons and arguments that resolved into something more solid. The 2 chairs on the cold porch that they'd ended up in not by plan, but by the gravity of habit. They sat in the cold as the dark came down, not talking anymore, the way they'd learned to be together in silence without it being absence, which was maybe the thing it had taken all 20 years to build, that particular quality of quiet. After a while, Clara said, "James is coming Sunday with the baby." "I know," Wade said. "Ruth said she'd come if the weather held." "It'll hold," he said. He looked at the sky. "Clear week." "You can't know that. I've been reading that sky for 30 years," he said. "And you're wrong regularly," she said. "Less than you think." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, something in between, and he turned and looked at her profile against the dark mountains and thought, as he'd thought maybe 1,000 times over the years, in 100 different lights, that the town of Black Creek had looked at her and seen the wrong things. They'd seen the size and the circumstances and the history and decided those were the whole story. They'd missed the thing underneath, the actual substance of who she was, because they were looking with the wrong instruments. He'd been lucky enough to look with the right ones, not because he was better than them. He was not, in most respects, better than the people of Black Creek. He was stubborn and occasionally difficult and slower to feelings than he should be, and he'd made mistakes in his life that he still carried. But on that particular afternoon, in that particular moment, he'd looked at a woman on a bench in the cold and seen something true. And that single act of clear seeing had given him everything that came after. That was the thing about judgment, about deciding what a person was worth before you knew them. It didn't just cost the person being judged, it cost you. Every person you dismissed on sight was a door you'd closed before seeing what was behind it, and most of the time that was a small loss, but sometimes behind that door was everything. He'd nearly walked past it. I thought about that sometimes in the way that you think about close calls, with a kind of cold retrospective recognition, the way you notice you nearly stepped into the road before the horse came through. He'd nearly kept his head down. He'd nearly let the town's laughter do his thinking for him. He'd been so well practiced at not caring, at keeping everything at the distance that grief required, that he'd almost applied that same practiced distance to a moment that didn't deserve it. I was glad he'd been tired of that distance. He was glad, whatever else he was and wasn't, that on one cold November afternoon in 1878, he'd had enough left in him to stop and look at who was actually there. The night settled in around them fully now, the stars coming out thick above the mountains, and the cold was real, and they'd have to go in soon. Inside there was a lamp and a warm stove and a house full of 20 years of being lived in, the marks on the kitchen door frame where they'd measured James and Ruth as they grew, the repairs visible in the parlor wall if you knew where to look, the root cellar that still needed work every few years and always would, Margaret's sewing basket still in the parlor because it had always been there and because Clara had never moved it and never would, and the new things layered over the old things the way new things always were in a house that kept going. "Going in," Clara said, not a question. "In a minute," he said. She stayed in her chair. The minute stretched, and neither of them moved, and the cold was something you simply absorbed, and above the mountains the stars did what Montana stars did. Filled the sky with more light than any city ever saw, indifferent and enormous, and very far away. And somehow, from the right porch, from the right chair, from the life you'd built around your own stubborn refusal to give up on things, somehow, exactly enough. Wade Coulter put his hand on his wife's arm, briefly, the way you touch something you want to make sure is still real. She put her hand over his. They sat in the dark until the cold finally drove them in, and then they went inside together and closed the door.